In truth semantics, we investigate the meaning of words, almost as if premises in a formal argument, where if the premises or the meanings of words are true, the conclusion or the proposition follows.
But what we're going to be covering today is truth semantics. It's one of the more difficult topics to get a comprehension of. It's not why morals are real or unreal. It's more about what makes something true, not necessarily in the sense that what it is that is true, meaning that why white is white and what make but the idea is that not are all the metaphysical facts of like what makes it white, but what are the things that you're discussing that causes white. um it's better interpreted by the idea of um you propose a proposition such as cars drive on wheels. So this is my proposition. I'm saying that cars drive on wheels. So what are the things that make this statement true? So, well, first, it's the definitional framework of what it means to be a car, right? If it were to be something like a boat and somebody called a car a boat, and if that's what their framework was based off of, they're discussing and considering a boat when I say car, that would be, this proposition would not work. So what defines a car is one of the things that makes this true. So you might say something that if you agree to the proposition that a car is defined by a motorized frame with four wheels designed for road transportation, then we can say that this is part of the things that determine the truth of this proposition. Now, the other thing is that we could define wheels. So wheels are uh, a circular rotating component that enables rolling motion. And then for that matter, we also have to define drive, what it means to drive. So to operate a vehicle so it moves along a surface. And then what you are also considering here is all the metaphysical facts that make driving possible. Things like gravity, things like the fact that there is friction, things like the fact that the road even exists and that there's physical structures that hold those things together. These are the metaphysical truths that uh, create the that create the necessity, or that necessitate the proposition that this is true. In other words, in counterfactual world where um, a car can hover, then we might not say that um, a car drives on wheels, because in this world, this counterfactual world, cars don't need wheels. Now, right now, we live in a world where that is a necessity. So, in a counterfactual world, this proposition would not be true because it does not meet the metaphysical natures, or I should say, the framework which makes this statement true. So, in the same sense that if there was an engine on in a car that allowed it to just traverse through time or space, and it didn't require rolling motions, then again, it may not mean that you're actually driving, and it also may not mean that it requires wheels. So it's these kind of statements that create a truth. So when somebody asks you something like, why is this statement true? This is kind of the rationale and framework that you should be looking to define terms and define metaphysical natures that create truth. This kind of comes from um, a moment that I had where I had a deer in the headlights moment as far as like what makes something true. It was difficult for me to work through the rationalization of how to define the truth in that sense of the statement. Now, again, it doesn't mean that my statement is true. For instance, I could say cars don't drive on wheels. So, and I could state a series of a definition of cars, a definition of wheels, and a definition of drive. Now, I could then be questioned that, why is that not the case that cars don't drive on wheels? And then someone could say, well, clearly you're wrong because your truth semantics don't work. Cars do drive on wheels. This is how they operate. Um, and then you could get into semantics. Well, I define wheels in this other alternative sense or something like that. And then that's another component that you kind of get into as far as, and this can happen with something as definitional as like how you define a person. Um, and that's why it's important to get clear on these concepts of and the frameworks when you're discussing uh, definitions of what makes something true, because it's important to investigate the framework and it um, particularly when you're talking about sort of metaphysical facts in natures, like such as like what gives people rights and other components like that. Um, so what I do want to try to get into a little bit is something to the effect of like what are the sort of the basis of like moral truths. Like there's premises of, or there's concepts of um, like forms of realism or subjectivism that about morals that create a sense of truth that may be more intuitive than others. So, like, there's a corresponding basis of theory. So, basically, a statement is true if it matches reality. So, snow is white is true because there exists snow and it has the property of being white. So, um, in this kind of sense, like Aristotle sort of somewhat said that truth is saying of what is that it is, sort of like defining something in that nature by its in its truest sense. Um, so, in this sort of truth maker theory, every truth must have something in the world that makes it true. So that's what is the truth maker, the thing that makes things true. Um, and that can kind of preside through multiple different theories of truth. Another one would be like coherence theories. So a statement is true if it fits coherently within a system of beliefs or propositions. So the truth maker may be the web of beliefs itself, internally consistent and mutually supported. So if if something is true in the sense that it is consistent and you have some sort of support framework for it. An example of this would be like in the scientific theory, a claim is true if it integrates without contradiction into a whole model. Um, so uh, the other component of any truth theory, any truth concept or theories. So it risks, in this particular instance, it could risk coherent but wrong. So it could be the basis that it is consistent, it's coherent in that it's not contradictory, such as something like a conspiracy theory, but it's still wrong. So something can be true in the sense that it is um, coherent in that framework, but not necessarily in the sense of true as in um, that it is factual or is the case. So, and that's another thing that some people might say is that instead of asking what makes this true, they might say something like, um, "Why is this the case?" Which essentially means something very similar, but it sort of hits tuitions a little differently. In pragmatic theories, the core idea might be truth is what works. So, what proves useful, reliable, or successful in practice. So, it might be the case that certain moral concepts uh, cannot be teased out that are practically implemented. So, we might use things in a pragmatic sense, i.e., into day to day life, that we can't rationalize back. But because it works, it's true. So it's sort of a sense of like, I don't know why it works, but it works. Kind of like this idea of, like quantum mechanics. I don't know why it works this way, but it does. So um, it's kind of in that sense a sort of lack of epistemic knowledge that just forgiven. So in that sense, pragmatism theories kind of work on like an axiom of belief of like, well, this works, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always the case, etc. But um, it could just be that it seems to be useful, reliable, and successful in practice. So people survive because when I do this thing in medicine, they come back to life. It's like, well, is that true? It's like, I don't know if it's true. It's just this works in the sense like this medicine cures headaches is true if the practice is consistently relieving headaches. Um, so this kind of gets in the same thing we did before with semantics and truth condition theories. This means the statement is uh, the meaning of the statement is given by the conditions under which it uh, is true. So the truth maker is the satisfaction of those conditions in a model of the world. As I said earlier, cars drive on wheels is true if the model uh, in the model, the set of cars all have the properties of driving on wheels. Um, so Kant was actually, I think it was Kant, was actually really mad during a webinar he did because the people in it kept thinking that the truth semantics was like it promised a sense of truth. It promised if these conditions are met, that these are the thing that without a doubt, no matter what the world was, is that it would be actually a factual statement. Um, and that's not the case. But he had a hard time getting people to understand it was just basically what is the substantive elements of a statement that make it true, that if investigated and proved and reduced to their axioms would still prove out to be true. um so in his sense, he was trying to convince people like, when I go to sit, or when I am sitting, I am sitting. I'm sitting. That is true because my butt's on a chair, etc. But like people kept trying to think of it as a sort of a inductive rule of inference, um, and or a deductive rule of inference, and it was not really the case there. So you have to be careful with how you're using this sort of truth semantic sense. It doesn't prove truths. It just tells you if you investigate these elements of the proposition, then it will reduce down to what makes them true. Um, Again, constructive theories, truth is what is agreed upon within a community under ideal conditions and discourse. Um, you're getting a little bit into more a social or intersubjective agreement. And that gets a little bit into the sort of subjectivity of truths or moral ideals. So we're going to go ahead and keep on going here. And so, like an epistemic theory of truth, so the truth is what would be justified or warranted under ideal epistemic conditions. The truth maker in that kind of context would be the eventual outcome of the inquiry by ideal reasoners. So, kind of like an ideal observers. So, there is life on Mars is true if, in the long run, ideal investigation would confirm it. So, like, if you had the quote unquote ideal observer, you would find that this is the fact. So, in this kind of sense, the ideal observer would be God, in the sense that this entity knows everything which is true. And because of that, it, in that thing's eyes, in God's eyes, that holds all truth if seen, it confirms that sense there. I did a terrible job of analyzing that, but basically, um the idea is that it's like the absolutes of truth in that sense, under the conditions there. um So there are other notable approaches. So there's performative theory. Saying it's true is a speech act that endorses the statement. So it's true because I said it's true. Pluralist theories. Different domains have different truths or properties. Moral truths can be uh, uh, coherence based. Physical truths can be correspondence based. Relative truth is relative to a framework, culture, or perspective. So that's sort of the subjectivity there. um, and then there's other elements here where you have like a deflationist would say that stop overthinking cars drive on wheels is true because cars drive on wheels. Like, just, you don't need to go deeper, man. Like, that's kind of like the deflationist perspective, is that they may be a deflationist on truth semantics. It's just like, look at the facts, but I think you need to be a little bit more. The idea is with the deflationist theories that you just basically say either you're, it's sort of like saying you're agnostic on something. It's just like, this is an axiom. This is where things exist. So I think you could go deeper than just saying that cars drive on wheels. I think you could investigate what makes that statement true further. Um, so again, with like moral realism, you're looking at like stance independent, true regardless of anyone's beliefs. Um, in that sense, that there might be metaphysically robust facts like H2O could be, in this sense, H2O regardless of what we see it as. So, um, and now water could be named anything regardless of the observer, but because of the metaphysical nature of hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms, when combined, it forms this substance that we understand to be water. But regardless of our observation or naming structure, this would still be true. So, in that sense, that's like the metaphysical robustness that a moral realist would basically go to prove out, in the sense that uh, morals would be true because that there's like a physical truth maker that like just comes in and just makes it true, or has the property of truth, in the same sense that H2O is H2O because it's two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, and that's the thing that makes it true. But I don't think of morals in that sort of robust sense, more of a relaxed realist. um so I mean, in the sense of like a relaxed realist take on like something like slavery is wrong is true because given the nature of persons and reasons, no one has sufficient reason to enslave others, not because wrongness exists at a metaphysical sense. It's sort of the modal facts and the sort of semantics of what means to have slavery is wrong because it it applies in the sense of violating a moral truth based off of those semantic facts or modal facts. Moral subjectivists might just say that like morals are again subjective. What's wrong versus right is different depending upon the person and the culture, etc. Um, so in that sense, like anything can be moral, but it's just how you feel about it. And they don't think that there's any sort of universal norms to that sort of moral truthness. Um, there's a bunch of different in betweens. There's hybrid theories. There's like other different correspondence on that. But that more or less covers the basis of it. You know, truth serves just as a grounding role. Their existence is what makes moral propositions true. And then robust realism. Yeah, that more or less runs through what I kind of wanted to run through on this. There's another one which is dispositional moral realism, which I do like. It's on the context of truth principles, moral propositions like slavery is wrong is true because slavery has the disposition to solicit disapproval from ideal agents, fully informed, rational, empathetic, etc. So that sort of is on the basis of like an ideal observer component there. So again, the truth makers, the dispositional properties to instantiate in the world slavery's position to solicit moral disapproval under ideal conditions. Somewhat like relaxed realism, sort of a little bit more metaphysically robust. But yeah, that is the rundown on making things true. That's the. I apologize for the misspellings too, by the way. It's just how AI did it. But yeah, so this is the sort of tendencies for how to look at facts of making things true, and how to sort of discuss and work through the rationalization of proving out your truths. Which may or may not be true. All right. Thanks for listening to me rant. And I appreciate the likes for whoever threw on the likes. See you next time on